Welcome to the Azapo Online Political Education platform. Today, I am playing host to Professor Gilingwe Mayende. We will be discussing the land repossession as a weapon for liberation, and he is here to give us his critical analysis. Professor Mayende holds a PhD, which he obtained in 1990 from the University of Hull in the United Kingdom. He was selected to be the visiting fellow and a senior associate member of St. Antony's College at Oxford University in the UK, where he conducted research on the land question in South Africa. And between the years 1995 and 2005, he served as a senior public servant in the South African government, during which time he held the positions of Director General of the Department of Land Affairs, and that was between the years 2000 and 2005. But before then, he was the Deputy Director General of the Eastern Cape Provincial Government from 1999 to 2000. He also worked as a Regional Land Claims Commissioner for the Eastern Cape and Free State governments between the 1995 and 1998 years. And since leaving the public service in 2005, he has held a variety of posts, and where he also worked at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at the Nelson Mandela University. He was a senior research fellow there. He holds a BA in Sociology and History from the University of Botswana, an MA in Development Sociology, and a PhD in Sociology, which he obtained from Hull, as I indicated earlier. He also holds a diploma in executive leadership from Wits and Harvard universities. And some of you would know, the PAC mantra back in time, land first, all else shall follow. He is the author of the PAC land policy, from which this mantra is derived. Currently, he works as a Deputy Vice Chancellor Operations at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, that is the CPUT down in the Cape. He is the author of a book, The Land and Agrarian Question, the First Frontier of Decolonization in South Africa. This book will be launched towards the end of this year. Please look out for it and have a read. Welcome, Professor Mayende, to this platform. It is great to have you here with us today.
Thank you very, very much. Comrade Simpiwe Ashe, for inviting me. Perhaps let me extend this sincere word of thanks to Azapo as an organization for inviting me to speak on this very important topic. And thank you for the introduction that you have given on myself. I will perhaps read just the introduction and conclusion of my paper, and I will try to go through the body of my presentation without having to read it word for word, but it will depend also on time constraints.
Sure.
As everybody is aware, the land question is important, not only because it has once again been thrust onto the center of national political and transformative discourse in South Africa, but mainly because it remains the primary pivot towards genuine liberation and socio-economic emancipation of the country's African majority. I prefer to use the term African to Black because I believe that the former references a territory, which is the territory of Africa. In addition, obviously, to the whole issue of identity and attitude of mind. As the topic of this paper correctly indicates, land repossession is a primary weapon and the main vector for a transition towards liberation. The land is the substance and symbol of indivisible nationhood, national independence, self-determination, and national culture. In fact, it is the center of gravity of all these elements. For without the definite and decisive resolution of the land question in favor of the dispossessed, there can be no meaningful transformation of the country, that is of South Africa. And is also the heritage of a people. And in Azania, which is South Africa, it is the heritage of the indigenous African people. So in order to place the analysis that I'm going to present today in proper perspective, I wish to structure my arguments by attempting to address the following questions. If perhaps the audience could note these questions. The first of these is, what is the land question to start with? Number two, what are the objective imperatives in the South African conjuncture that necessitate the resolution of the land question? Number three, what is the distinction between land repossession and land reform? And why is such a distinction important? Four, what is the relationship between the land and national questions? Number five, why is it impossible for the land question to be resolved under the current policy trajectory and constitutional context in South Africa? And lastly, number six, what are the fundamental constituent features of genuine land repossession? So invariably, Chair, in dealing with these questions, or rather dealing with these questions, requires the presentation of both the critique as well as concrete proposals, and it also requires the construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction of relevant concepts and practical issues and themes, so as to arrive at what one believes to be a proper analytical synthesis and position. So let us start with the first question. What is the land question? The first aspect of the land question addresses the issue of whom sovereignty over the land devolves to. The second aspect is linked to the historical phenomenon of dispossession. The third aspect revolves around the methodology of repossession, which speaks to both epistemological and ontological dimensions, and more specifically to the question of agency. In other words, it speaks to the question of who should lead or participate in this land struggle. Put differently, this third aspect of the land question evokes serious reflection upon the question of whether such agency rests solely with the state and its administrative organs, or primarily with the people and their structures and organizations, or where possible and desirable, working in tandem with the state. Further, this calls for a serious interrogation of the question of whether resolving the land question is a top-down or a bottom-up process. In addition to these observations, the land question is also multidimensional in the sense that it involves rural, urban, and other spatial features, and it integrates social, economic, political, cultural, and other facets. Now, coming to the question of sovereignty over the land, I would like to start by saying one of the least acknowledged and understood features of the reformulation of the strategy for prosecuting the liberation and socialist struggle that the great Chinese leader Mao Zedong presented during his retreat to Yan'an in the early 1930s after he had carried out a careful and thorough analysis of the situation following the series of defeats and setbacks that the Red Army had suffered on the battlefield, is that he not only called for re-strategizing that would take into account the objective social, economic, and political conditions that prevailed in China at the time. Chairman Mao also laid emphasis on the need for Chinese revolutionaries to take history as their veritable point of departure in both their analysis and praxis. The victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949 thus underscores the fact that a clear understanding of the history of one's country constitutes a key platform for devising correct strategies to resolve important issues such as that of land. Thus, Chair, with the exception of the most ardent purveyors of conservative settler colonial myths, as well as the adherents of liberal formulations in their different variants, the issue of sovereignty over the land need not be controversial. Even the most right-wing archaeologists acknowledge the fact that indigenous Africans, that is the Khoikhoi, the San, and the Bantu speakers, so-called perhaps, all trace their ancestry to the first Homo sapiens who lived on the territory as far back as 300,000 years ago. Numerous archaeological sites across virtually every habitable part of the territory demonstrate the widespread existence of settlements, use of the land through hunting, gathering, and food production systems, that is arable cultivation and livestock rearing, mining, and extensive trade networks, some of which went as far as the coast along the Indian Ocean. These activities spanned periods that have been designated as the Stone Age and the Iron Age. And as we all know now, Mapungubwe, and perhaps to a lesser extent, Bambanjanalo, on the northernmost part of the country, constitute the leading examples of these incontrovertible and incontrovertible facts, as well as of the ancient civilizations that once thrived in our country. Now, putting aside, Chair, you know, the false narratives about First People, and I put this in quotes, the so-called coincidence, again in quotes, of maritime and land-based odysseys of migration, and the supposed but never proved, quote, dispossession of the Khoikhoi and San by the Bantu, close quotes. The historiography actually demonstrates close and largely peaceful interaction among these groups, as attested to by linguistic, physiological, and cultural affinities and identities, as well as other factors. Of course, violent conflicts and population movements did occur among and within various African politics and communities, but these were never to the extent or on the scale that the racist historians want us to believe. Thus, it remains correct to refer to the year 1652 as having inaugurated the onset of a violent colonial intrusion into the lives of the indigenous Africans, which assumed the form of a systematic and incremental process of dispossessing the Africans of their land and other assets, such as cattle. As the historical record clearly demonstrates, Chair, this process began in the western and northwestern parts of the country, where the Khoikhoi and San were largely concentrated. And as the military strength and the administrative capacity of the colonists grew in tandem with increased investment by the mother colonial countries of Holland and Britain, the colonists turned their attention to the eastern, central, northeast, northwest, and eventually the northern parts of the country. again, contrary to the assertions of Western and white liberal historians, taking the land from all these societies was not an easy proposition or process. While these historians have been unable to conceal the more obvious devastating defeats that the colonies suffered in spite of their superior arms, such as those at Isandlwana in the east, it is an incontestable fact that Africans stood their ground for many years, as attested to by the 9 so-called frontier wars. In fact, wars of dispossession and in defense of the land that were fought at the Cape, the 4 major wars against Basotho under King Moshoeshoe in the central regions, the military resistance waged by Kgosi Yanki and Kgosi Kgaleshewe on the northwestern parts, and those by Kgosi Machado and Gungunyane in the northern plateaus. Contrary to popular notions of spear-wielding impis fighting vainly against the bullets of the invaders as if on a dash wish, the courage and tenacity of the resistance bears testimony to the heroic quest by our ancestors to defend their land against foreign invaders with everything at their disposal. The fact that subsequently, by 1913, the colonists had completed and were consolidating their dispossession of the land of the Africans as spoils of conquest is now a matter of record. The same applies to the fact that by 1936, the distribution of the land was 87% for the white settlers and 13% for the Africans. Needless to say, this fact of conquest does not and can never extinguish the quest for the repossession of the land. Similarly, the fact that the colonists cemented their hold over the territory by exclusively proclaiming through the Union of South Africa Act of 1909, a union of the territories that they took from the Africans by force of arms, does not grant legitimacy to the original theft of the land. Moreover, the introduction of apartheid in 1948, which added fascist and ultra-racist dimensions to the settler colonial system, did not in any way alter the fundamental colonial nature of the South African social formation. The same applies to the unilateral declaration of South Africa as a quote-unquote republic in 1961, whose purpose and effect were to further consolidate the system of settler colonialism and racial capitalism. Thus, based on the foregoing, the land question in South Africa is therefore fundamentally a historical question. Its either dimension and contemporary features will be dealt with later in my presentation. But before moving on to that analysis, it is important to emphasize the fact that before 1994, South Africa was neither a colony of a special type, quote unquote, nor does it belong to all who live in it, black and white. Settler colonialism bestows neither a right of sovereignty to colonial invaders and land thieves, nor does it confer an equal status to the colonizer and the colonized. The absurdity of a declaration that proclaims South Africa as belonging to all who live in it, black and white, thus lies at the very core of an attempt to subvert the decolonial nature and ethos of the land question and struggle. It was precisely in recognition of the fact that South Africa is the heritage of the indigenous African people that the African Claims document, which the African National Congress, that is the ANC, adopted in 1943, foregrounded the restoration of the usurped land to its original owners, the African people. The land question is also neither a legalistic or technical issue about constitutions, legislation, the minutiae of projects or hectares. It is a fundamental social, economic, and political issue that lies at the core of a people's quest to repossess their heritage and assets and to restore their dignity and to launch themselves on the road to development and prosperity. The actions of the people matter more than constitutions and laws. Of course, constitutions and laws are essential and necessary ingredients for the orderly management of the affairs of the state and public affairs. But it is the actions of the people, and this is a matter that I deal with later when I talk about agency, that matter more. And lastly, in defining the land question, it's important to highlight the fact that the land question is also gender neutral, but addressing it deliberates, addressing it now from this perspective of gender neutrality requires deliberate measures anchored in legislation and policy that are aimed at eliminating existing social and cultural barriers that militate against the ability of women and youth to become real beneficiaries of land redistribution and related support. Now, allow me, Chair, to speak to the question of the objective imperatives in the South African conjuncture that necessitate the resolution of the land question. The first imperative in this regard is the dreadful and horrifying extent of poverty, inequality, social and economic marginalization, hopelessness, and underdevelopment that are the main features of the lives of the vast majority of the country's inhabitants. It is not a matter for debate that this situation derives directly from dispossession and other deliberate policies that were implemented by the settler colonial state. As of 2021, South Africa's Gini or Gini coefficient is placed at 63%, which remains the highest in the world. In other words, poverty, inequality, underdevelopment, and marginalization are a manufactured phenomenon in South Africa as part of a program of social engineering. While poverty and inequality have numerous features, mostly urban and rural, for the sake of illustration, allow me, Chair, to focus on the rural, just to illustrate the point that I want to make. In other words, because addressing this situation is impossible without a strategy of decolonization. In other words, a strategy that is aimed at comprehensively eradicating the social and economic vestiges of settler colonialism and putting in their place a new arrangement. So the land question then, in this context, becomes one of the primary enablers of decolonization and development. Although I'm focusing on the agrarian sector, Chair, it's important for one to point out that obviously not everyone can be a farmer, in as much as not everyone can be a teacher or a soldier. But I will try to show how the agrarian transition or an agrarian revolution is positioned strategically to have knock-on effects in such a way that it would have knock-on effects to the rest of the economy and society. Now, just to illustrate the phenomenon of poverty, I know to a very large extent I'm preaching to the converted. But as recently as 2017, Statistics South Africa, in its poverty trends report, reported that poverty, now absolute poverty, not relative poverty, but absolute total poverty, had increased exponentially between 2006 and 2015 afflicting 55% of the population, or 30.4 million people, most of whom live in the rural areas and urban informal settlements. Many households in the former Bantustans survive primarily not through agricultural production, but mostly from social grants provided by the government, and those who can engage in some form of farming do so at subsistence level. And the average plot size of a plot of land in these territories is a mere 1.5 hectares, which clearly shows that very little productive activity can take place, especially given the fact that such activity would be taking place under rain-dependent conditions. Cutting across all of this is a terminal crisis of unemployment, which at this point in time in 2021 is conservatively estimated to be 32.6%, and among the youth it is 46.3%. On the other hand, Chair, I would like to point out that the commercial agricultural sector, the white-dominated commercial agricultural sector, is not the cornucopia of plenty that it is often touted to be. So it is a further indictment of the currently unequal structure of land ownership, that the country produces surpluses and exports large quantities of food crops, around 26% of 14 million, while around 26% of 14 million of its inhabitants are food insecure. South Africa is the largest exporter of maize on the African continent, but many of the inhabitants of the country go hungry every day. Whilst indeed the commercial agricultural sector in South Africa, which is white dominated, does exhibit some characteristics of a highly developed or commercially vibrant sector, this conceals a number of structural, social, and economic deficiencies that have far-reaching consequences for the social, economic, and political sustainability and stability of the country. Now, this fact is conveniently ignored by those who are prone to making thinly disguised and racially inspired warnings against the possibility of massive starvation should Africans be involved significantly in agricultural production. As we all know, there is a narrative in this country that seeks to portray agriculture as the preserve of whites and also black people as incapable to farm, which is basically a racial notion, which is disproved by the fact that Africans, indeed, before they were totally dispossessed, were able even to outperform their white counterparts in the area of agriculture. But today, it is said that they cannot farm. And again, it's very important to note that only 25% of white agricultural producers are the ones who are producing beyond, or rather were high output producers. The rest produce average yields, are heavily indebted, and so on. So in other words, this notion that the agricultural sector in South Africa is being carried by all the 39,000 or so white farmers is actually a false notion, which needs to be debunked. Statistics provided by the then Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries showed that there were 39,966 commercial farming units, in other words, white commercial farmers in 2007, having declined from 45,801 in 2002 and from 60,938 in 1996. The abstract of agricultural statistics for 2020 shows that this number is now 40,122. So there are some fluctuations that need to be checked. And the land audit that was conducted by the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform in 2017 revealed that whites own 72% of the total land parcels owned by individuals. This is about 2.6 million hectares. But when you are factoring in companies, trusts, and others, this figure rises to 90%. So overwhelmingly, the land that we're talking about in South Africa is in the hands of white individual farmers as well as companies and trusts. Another defining characteristic of the land in South Africa is that of the white-owned land, which is being held as the spoils of dispossession, is that it is held by large, a few monopolies and large corporations such as Anglo-American, Genco, Rembrandt, and Barloworld. And as we all know, within these farms, the labor relations assume a semi-feudal character and are characterized also by despotism. I'm using the term, I'm borrowing the term despotism from one of the authors and specialists and on the agrarian question in South Africa, Mr. Heliker. And people like Andile Mngxitama, for example, have shown that farm workers are citizens without rights, and they have a status that is akin to what Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, in his famous book, Citizen and Subject, that he published in 1996, refers to as subjects. So the ultra exploitation of farm workers in a manner reminiscent of the worst excesses of the apartheid colonial era persists in the post-apartheid period. And it does so unabated. And then we have, if you want to conduct an analysis of the white farmers as a social category, you'll find that they are self-serving, conservative, male-dominated. And through their main organization, which is Agri-SA, they have tried to recalibrate themselves by giving them the impression of political correctness, claiming to have shared their reactionary character. But that nothing is further than the truth. This group, in reality, rarely puts its money where its mouth is in relation to land reform, quote unquote, which it claims to support, but does so rhetorically rather than practically. It is at the forefront of resisting any moves to fight illegal evictions from farms, for example. So this group that dominates our food production system in South Africa is a reactionary group that is governed by retrograde ideas and is anathema to genuine transformation of South Africa's agricultural sector in the country as a whole. So the resolution of the land question should therefore be located at the center of a conscious effort, not only to restore the people's birthright, but also to redress these historical wrongs and to set the country on a genuine process of development. This is a point I've already made. Now, in the book that you referred to, Chair, I propose a concept of a second agrarian transition in South Africa. As we are aware, the first transition was the colonially inspired one that took place at the turn of the 19th century, from 10 of the 20th century, from 1900 onwards, where you found that a process of concentration of land holdings went in tandem with rapid capitalization. Obviously, all of this anchored upon the dispossession of the Africans. Now, in this concept of a second agrarian transition, one is calling for the restructuring of the entire agricultural sector, firstly, through a process of redistribution of the land, which will be undergirded by the principle of demographic proportionality and the implementation of sustainable land ceilings, which will be determined according to agroecological and other relevant considerations. Incidentally, Chair, this concept of demographic proportionality is not new. It dates back to 1914, when Solomon Tsekiso Plaatje led a deputation to King George V of Britain. And the petition that he presented in Britain, obviously, was he and his group were denied an audience with the king at the time, the British king. In that petition, you'll find the following statement, quote, "The natives should be put into possession of land in proportion to their numbers on the same conditions as the white race." So again, there is an element of magnanimity in the concept of demographic proportionality. But again, we should remember that when we contextualize the language question within the context of the resolution of the national question, we should also bear in mind that we are not talking about driving anybody to the sea, back to Europe or wherever they came from, but we are talking about ensuring that the land is restored to its original owners, and that access to the land would then be distributed equitably. And the best way of ensuring that is by invoking and applying the principle of demographic proportionality. So where a group constitutes 8% of the population, then as an act of magnanimity, as the African people, I see nothing wrong for us to allocate 8% of that land, of the land, to that group in that context. Insofar as the Bantustans are concerned, it's obvious that at least the way I see it from the point of view of this second agrarian transition, that agricultural development cannot occur unless a process of consolidation of those small plots takes place in order to ensure that the land is allocated to those who can make optimal productive use of it. And then the rest of the population in this area have to be addressed or have to be assisted through serious and meaningful rural development interventions, much more than what we have seen thus far. In fact, thus far, we have not seen anything coming even close to rural development since 1994. So what is the distinction between repossession of the land and land reform? And here I will attempt now to be brief in my comments. As noted, Chair, just to remind yourself and the audience, repossession foregrounds the restoration of sovereignty over the land. which in turn opens up pathways towards an indigenous-led development process. Repossession of the land should therefore not be seen in isolation from overall national development. In other words, in actual fact, it should be at the center, or if not at the lead, of all thinking and strategizing around the whole issue of national development. On the other hand, land reform constitutes attempts to reform a status quo through the implementation of limited changes which do not fundamentally alter the essential features of that status quo. A clear example is the fact that the three pillars of South Africa's land reform program, namely restitution, redistribution, and tenure reform, are all subjected to caveats, either in the form of cutoff dates or the setting of targets in terms of hectares or farms to be delivered within a specific period. Let me just illustrate this very quickly. The restitution program, for instance, is circumscribed by a historically tenuous and unjustifiable cutoff date of 19 June 1913. I need not belabor this point. It's self-explanatory and self-evident that it does not make sense that you should talk of a land restitution program based on land claims that is limited to a particular time in the history of the country, as if land dispossession began in 1913. As I indicated, what happened in 1913 was a process of consolidation of the spoils of conquest. By then, the land had, for all intents and purposes, been taken away. And with regard to the redistribution program, from the time of the RDP, that is the Reconstruction and Development Program in the early 1990s, redistribution was set at a target of 30% of all land in the country to be delivered in 5 years at that time, which was later changed to 15 years. Again, you are reforming, so you set limits. That is why I'm saying land reform is by definition, is defined by the fact that it has limits and caveats. And the third pillar, which is tenure reform, focuses on farm workers, labor tenants, and other rural development, rural dwellers, and those resident in communal areas. Now, the question is, why should you specify those categories? Yes, indeed, those are the primary categories that are there, who live on land and who have proximity to land. But what necessitates the fact that we now have, as the third pillar, something that focuses on categories such as those? What about military veterans? What about, there are so many other categories of people who would be, there are even people who are resident in urban areas who are there because they have no choice but to move to those areas and live in the squalid conditions in informal settlements. Because in the rural areas, there's virtually no means of livelihood. What about those people? Now, coming to the question of the method of repossession, I want to make clear that I subscribe to the concept of socialization as against nationalization, but the two are interrelated. The former refers to a situation where resources are shared among the people utilizing their own structures. On the other hand, simple nationalization in its crudest form denotes state ownership and control and does not necessarily guarantee that the people will play an effective role in the distribution and use of resources. Thus, nationalization is a necessary first step that should be driven by a process of expropriation but the whole point must be about socialization of the land. The issue of expropriation, which has become topical in the current discourse in South Africa about land or expropriation without compensation, quote unquote, has to be anchored on a clear political declaration of intent rather than intricate attempts to tinker with constitutional provisions. In other words, Chair, the country's constitution must foreground the issue of dispossession. You don't find the word dispossession in the constitution, not at least not in its preamble. So this issue is not foregrounded. And the constitution must also provide for expansive expropriation while placing all land acquired through colonial dispossession or the forced removal of Africans outside of any constitutional or legal protection. In other words, what we have now in the form of Section 25 of the Constitution has to be repealed in total, so that we have a formulation that goes along the lines which I'm proposing. Firstly, to foreground dispossession, and then to come up with terms and conditions under which the land is to be acquired and redistributed. On the vexed issue of compensation, in principle, Chair, there should be no compensation, being as it is that this land was obtained through colonial conquest and therefore its ownership has no legitimacy. This applies even to those instances where current landowners may claim no historical association with the initial act of dispossession. As the fact of the matter is that regardless of number of owners that the land passes through, the land in question does not cease to be the spoils of dispossession. Moving from the principle that there should be no compensation, perhaps on moral grounds, purely on moral grounds, compensation may be paid, but it should be limited. This compensation should not be paid for the land, but it can be limited to developments on the land. That is, physical structures, dams, fencing, silos, trees planted, etc., on moral grounds. And what is also important in this context is that the price or the money or the amounts paid by the settler colonial government to support the farmers should be discounted when computing this limited compensation. And certainly, the willing buyer, willing seller system has to be rejected in total, as it has no moral basis, and it in fact flies in the face of the genuine quest for genuine decolonization of land ownership. And lastly, when it comes to, under this segment, when it comes to the tenure issue, one proposes the issuing of long-term leases, active and commercial land. And then for residential land, families should be allowed to actually own those properties and to pass them on from one generation to the next. I am aware that there's been a lot of debate around the issue of leasehold versus private tenure. And the liberal take on the issue is that private tenure is a stronger form of tenure and so on and so forth. But that is another myth and another fallacy. In all the countries, without exception, that have industrialized rapidly, where land reform or land redistribution took place, and here I can mention Korea, Vietnam, China. You know, you do find that by and large, those who hold the land do so under long-term leases. And those, the performance of those people, of those families, of those holders of the land, in economic terms, is phenomenal. As we speak, China is the largest agricultural producer in the whole world. So it is wholly mythological to say that, or mythical to say that freehold tenure is a stronger form of tenure. Coming up to the relationship between the land question and the national question, Chair, I'm going to try to step onto the accelerator a little bit so that we can move a bit faster, but I'm not far from concluding my input, Chair. Here, I would like to point out that the relationship between the land question and the national question pivots around the issues of sovereignty, again, independence, self-determination, national cohesion, and identity. It therefore stands to reason that whilst the overwhelming majority of the indigenous inhabitants of South Africa have no or limited access to land, the forging of a national identity, a common culture, peace, and enduring stability, as well as a united nation, will remain an impossibility. For the majority of Africans whose identity and relationship to the land continues to be largely that of laborers, landless peasants, or so-called squatters on their ancestral lands, and generally as a people denied access to land for a variety of social and economic purposes, their mere citizenship of the country thus lacks authentic existential content. You are just a citizen, but you do not belong. That is what actually exists at this point in time. That is who the Africans, or the overwhelming majority of Africans in our country are. They are citizens, but they do not belong. The link between the land and national questions has been part of South Africa's political discourse since the 1940s, when Dr. A.P. Xuma was the president of the ANC and oversaw the incorporation of the concept of redistribution into the document entitled African Claims in South Africa, Bill of Rights and the Atlantic Charter, that the ANC adopted on 14 December 1943. Although no clear program grew out of the African Claims document to give effect to the specific demands around the area of land, the document was to bequeath an enduring legacy to the liberation struggle. Examples of this is the Defiance Campaign of 1942 and the more militant program of action that was adopted by the ANC Youth League in 1949. All these can trace their genesis to the African Claims document. So then, while the introduction of the philosophy of African nationalism in the 1940s raised the bar in sharpening strategic and tactical focus upon the land question and its articulation, the ANC's adoption of the Freedom Charter in 1955 and its multiracialist precepts were seen by the Africanists as having peripheralized the decolonial character of the land question. Hence, a schism occurred, which has persisted to this day and continues to animate the divisions in the ongoing discourse around the country's land question, as well as the unresolved national question. So the national question remains unresolved because that the creation of a nation characterized by a unitary national identity and consciousness and national culture and a truly non-racial country are only possible after the resolution of the land question. So in other words, the two are two sides, the land question and the national question are two sides of the same coin. Why is it impossible for the land question? Why is it impossible for the land question to be resolved under the present policy trajectory? and constitutional context in South Africa? In answering this question, it must first be pointed out that South Africa's land reform is the product of a liberal project and is being pursued as part of a neoliberal economic agenda. While liberalism has played a dominant role in shaping land reform policy through the role that was played by white liberals in the development of the ANC's land policy during the period 1990 to 1993, neoliberalism in the sphere of land was informed by the World Bank, which imposed its prescriptions about so-called negotiated and market-based land reform. Those are the fault lines which characterize South Africa's land reform policy. And that is the first issue which one wants to highlight in pointing out why it is impossible under the current trajectory. As Steve Biko said, you know, the controlling propensities of white liberals have the effect of putting a brake on the onward march of Black people towards shaping the content and form of their own liberation. Now, the cutoff dates that I've referred to, limited redistribution targets, all emanate from the prescriptions that the liberals and the World Bank imposed on the negotiation process. And it also resulted in a perverted approach towards agrarian transformation that seeks to leave the agricultural sector firmly in the hands of white land barons, while making proposals for a tenuous notion of smallholder development for the majority of Africans. In other words, the Africans must get their crumbs while the whites continue to enjoy the bigger part, the bigger chunk of the land and the benefits that accrue from it. Sadly, or perhaps in a way not unexpectedly, these notions have been carried over into the National Development Plan, that is the NDP, which engages in convoluted spin around the notion of the expansion, quote unquote, of the present agricultural sector while leaving current land holding systems intact, which is another wrong notion, where the NDP says there is scope to expand agriculture, leave what is there as it is, and expand on its fringes. I'm sure I leave it to the imagination of the listeners where this additional land would be situated. So as things stand, even the NDP does not add value to the discourse on agrarian transformation and on the land question in a broader sense. Then lastly, what are the constituent features of genuine land repossession? And I'm now moving towards the conclusion, Chair. The first obvious step, to my mind, in this direction is for the political formations to move beyond mere sloganeering and short-termism, and that they must come up with clear programs that reflects a close association with the broad masses of the African population. In other words, it's a call to get off our high horses and to drill further down to the ground where the people are. What this also means is that such a program must be aimed at altering the balance of class and social forces towards genuine land repossession. Because for as long as the masses are left behind, the elite will continue to call the shots and to determine the character and pace of quote unquote land reform, limited as it is. So this social mobilization that I'm calling for should embrace the initiatives and struggles of the community-based organizations and structures. Some of these already exist, such as Abahlali baseGondolo, the Land Access Movement of South Africa, that is LAMOSA, the Trust for Community Outreach and Education, TCOE, which is a Black consciousness linked structure, and the entire network of civil society organizations that are called Chinja Amakaya and other similar formations. As things stand, these organizations are out there on their own, and we all know the struggles that they are engaged in and the setbacks and difficulties that they have to face on the ground. It needs not be overemphasized that there exists no historical record of repossession or redistribution of land having occurred successfully without a strong and organized grassroots participation and trust. I see one of my good friends is on the platform, Professor Kondo. I remember back in 1992, if 1993 it was, when we were involved in a radio debate together with Professor Itumeleng Musala. And I pointed to the example of Chile under Salvador Allende, where the tragedy of that revolution, when President Allende was overthrown, emanated from the fact that that revolution had not consolidated and strengthened itself on the ground in terms of cementing a strong relationship with the masses on the ground. Hence, the reactionary coup that was staged by General Augusto Pinochet, obviously with the instigation and support of the United States through the CIA, became successful. So it's very important to bear this in mind. In those cases where progressive states have been in existence, political parties have worked in close association with grassroots structures, and in the process, they have developed programs that bear the imprint and input of those structures and not vice versa. Again, as Chairman Mao Zedong once said, one must be a student of the masses before becoming their leader. And as Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe once wrote, and I quote, our policies must flow from the logic of the African situation and from the fundamental long-term interests of the vast African millions. Another imperative is to institutionalize the habit of research and evidence-based approaches to organizational and programmatic work. And this, I'm saying, I'm addressing this issue not only to scholars and academics, but also to holders of political office and to leaders of political organizations and formations. Lastly, but also very importantly, the program of land repossession requires strong, well-informed, and committed servant leadership. So allow me to read my very brief conclusion at this point in time. It's very brief, a few lines. In this paper, Chair, I've attempted to provide an analytical survey of some of the key issues that I believe to be pertinent to the topic of land repossession in South Africa. I'm consciously aware that there are many more aspects and dimensions of the topic, which is demonstrative of its complexity. It is insufficient to focus on the legal and constitutional issues and perspectives, which in his latest book, Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, that is his book published in 2021, marshals and articulates so ably. That is the legal and constitutional issues, perspectives, and and dimensions of the land question. It is precisely because of the limitations that are inherent in approaches that privilege the primacy of particular disciplines, in this case law, the discipline of law, that the need for an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach becomes even more relevant and urgent. In other words, no single discipline possesses the entire spectrum of analytical, methodological, and practical tools that are necessary in order to do justice to such an enormous task. Excuse the pun. Thus, what remains outstanding in South Africa is a serious intellectual project that should involve bringing together various strands of fields of study, such as law, sociology, political science, and economics, and synthesize these into a dynamic and holistic analysis. African intellectuals, academics, and activists owe this to their people and to the memory of their ancestors. Thank you very much, Chair. With that, I end my presentation. Once again,
wow. Thank you, Professor Mayenda, for an excellent presentation. And you would have seen that I allowed you to go beyond the time that I had allocated, largely because of the, the interesting propositions that you present in your paper. And I'm sure we will try and engage with a couple of issues that you raise in your paper. Because I think it's important that we gain alignment, as activists, revolutionary activists, and as land activists, people who are engaged in this struggle for the liberation of our land, and we premise our liberatory effort on the need to repossess our land. So it is important that we engage with the subject and gain alignment. And those of you who have been involved in this project of struggle would know that the easiest thing to do is to overthrow the system. That is the easiest thing to do. But you need alignment, and you need the agency to get to that position. And the most difficult thing in any revolutionary struggle is to convince those who are oppressed that they are oppressed, is to convince those who are engaged in struggle or should be engaged in struggle of the importance of their role in the advancement of that struggle that will liberate them. And I think that is why we do what we do, largely to educate one another and inform one another about why it is that we are engaged in this struggle. I am going to allow commentary from people who want to comment on the presentation. You can do so by raising your hand, and you can also do so by providing your commentary through the Q&A or the chat platform. And I see that there are a number of inputs that are coming through already, through the chat platform, so which is good. So those of you who want to make contributions can. Professor Mayenda, you have made a number of points that are very interesting in your presentation. And I just want to start off maybe towards the end of your presentation, where you speak about the equitable redistribution of land based on the demographics of the country. It really, I must say, reminds me of Cecil John Rhodes when he was on an effort to take over our land, through the the fight for the mining lands of our country and the mining lands of Zimbabwe, towards the introduction of the Glenn Gray Act of 1894, where they were basically introducing a similar concept of distributing the land, through those parcels on the basis of the demographics, on the basis of the number of people who were available close to those mines so that they can help the mine. How different is your proposition to what Cecil John Rhodes proposed in the 1800s when they were taking over land? Because you would recall that Cecil John Rhodes, as one of those people who was leading those campaigns at the time, they forcefully removed people from their lands, and then they decided to then apportion on the basis of the number of families that were there. That this is the piece of land and this is the size of the land that you will be getting, and that is why we see a lot of people living in the enclaves where they are found right now, and largely because of some of those contributions. Now, there's this other question which Professor Kondlo is asking. You would have seen that part of the package of the ANC's land reform program is about the expropriation of the existing land, and they call it expropriation. I don't know why it is that they refer to it as expropriation when they speak about the release of the state land, because that land is already belonging to the state. It does not need to be expropriated. And they saying they want to release this as part of addressing the land reform question in the country. And now Professor Kondlo is asking, to what extent can state land help to deal with the land hunger that you referred to earlier in your presentation? Because we are made to believe that state land can contribute towards solving poverty and unemployment in the country. Now, to what extent can this help? Maybe if you can help us with those questions to start off with.
Would you like me to respond now?
Yeah, you can respond.
All right. The first one about what Rhodes did, under the auspices of the Glenn Gray Act. Obviously, that was part of the colonial project. He used, in fact, he did not use the principle of demographic proportionality. He used a divisive approach, which was informed by a desire to separate those Africans who were seen to be capable of adding value to the mining project that he was implementing from the rest of the African population. And in the process, engaged in a further act of dispossessing Africans, because those who were deemed not to fit in were shunted aside. So the two really cannot be compared. The principle of demographic proportionality, when applied to a situation where you say, for example, at this point in time, there is something in the vicinity of 101 million hectares of land that can be utilized for agricultural purposes, or that are being utilized. Well, bearing in mind that some of that land is not being utilized in any event, but land with potential for agricultural production amounts to about 101 million hectares in South Africa at this point in time. And about 90% of all of that is in the hand of white individuals, companies and trusts. And the individuals amount to something in the vicinity of 40,000, just 40,000. They have access to the best land in the country. And then the remainder, the other 10%, if you like, is in the hands of Africans who are already resident in the so-called communal areas in the lexicon of this day and age. But these are the former Bantustans, where most of us happen to have our ancestral homes. So you find that the issue then that one is proposing is to actually change all of that by seeing to it that the majority or the bulk of that land is distributed amongst the Africans who are the original owners of the land. And then, as I said, for the sake of magnanimity, which is a common trait of us as Africans, a proportion of that land can still be allocated to some white farmers according to their numbers. As Sol Plaatje said over a century ago, in proportion to their numbers. In other words, if their numbers are in the vicinity of 8%, as I understand they are at this point in time, then 8% of the 101 million hectares is what can be considered to be redistributed to them. So that is how the principle will apply. So the two are really, I want to believe, incomparable as such. Now, the second question about state land, I think we need to debunk this myth about state land in South Africa. And in so doing, to consider the following. Number one, indeed, there's a lot of land that belongs to the state. But this is land which is being used or has been designated for what is called state domestic purposes, where you have your prisons, your hospitals, your bridges, and so on and so forth. If you compute in percentage terms the amount of all that land, it might look like it's significant. But once you set all of that aside, because this is land which has already been being utilized, then you remain with a small portion. And again, this so-called state land also includes, by the way, the land in the former Bantustans, some of which used to be held under what was called the South African Development Trust. So that again diminishes the amount of land which can be referred to as state land, which leaves us with probably nothing more than 5% of all the agricultural land. And some of that agricultural state land, by the way, is also encumbered through leases and so on, where you find a small number of African farmers are holding some of those leases. So it boggles the mind when one tries to think of what is being referred to and where this land is supposed to be situated when we talk about state land. In fact, to be honest, it's one of those mythical notions that continue to be bandied about. And for some reason, this issue continues to be so stubborn. It's so stubbornly fixed or fixated in the minds of our policymakers. But in reality, state land, as a potential source for redistribution is not as big as an issue as it is often made to be. Thanks.
No, thanks, Professor Mayende. I just want to go back now to the definition of land itself. You know, one of the important things about land is, you know, the importance of sovereignty, I guess. And your presentation focused, you know, much more on, you know, addressing the agrarian question and, you know, focusing on food security and food production. Would you agree with me that land is much more than, you know, the farming land? It includes the sea, it includes the mines, it includes, you know, what is above and what is underneath, you know, the land. And if so, how is it then that we would conceptualize a solution to our land only through the, what you call the equitable redistribution of that land according to the percentages or the demographic percentages that prevail in the country? Why is it that we can't look at this land solution more in terms of what would be in the best interest of the country? And what would be in the best interest of the country is to generate, you know, economic activity that would enable this country to prosper. And that may not necessarily require the, what you call the equitable redistribution in terms of the demographic, you know, apportionment of, you know, people of the land. So that is one question I have for you. And moving on from that, earlier on, you put a lot of emphasis on the agency, and the agency being, you know, people, and you seem to allude to the fact that it may not be possible to resolve the land question or to repossess the land without a radical contribution from, you know, people on the ground. And virtually, it would be impossible to address in succinct terms the land question through, you know, the parliamentary processes. And whatever we do through the parliamentary processes would amount to reforms that would always remain cosmetic. Now, the question that arises is whether a parliament that comprises of people who are patriotic to the land and who are patriotic to the country would not be able to enact appropriate legislation and laws that would lead to, you know, the question of land being addressed in the manner that those people who were dispossessed of the land would be happy and comfortable.
Thank you very much for those very important observations and questions. Indeed, the definition of land really, as I indicated in my introduction, goes much further than agricultural land. As such, it has so many dimensions, which include, for example, the question of land for housing and the question of land for other forms of productive activity in and around urban areas. But I chose to focus on agricultural land, as I indicated, for the purpose of illustration. Yes, and because I'm aware also of time and space constraints. And in that context, I also took into account the fact that, as we all know, perhaps, agrarian revolutions or agricultural revolutions can and have in the past in many countries provided the basis and the spur for further developments. And when you talk of the question of prosperity, for example, you do find that the trigger point, which begins with the agrarian transformation, has a number of knock-on effects on other forms of economic activity. For example, if we were, let us just assume that what one has been saying does happen, where the land gets redistributed and the new entrants into the system of agricultural production are adequately supported, then what you then have is a situation where there would be greater demands for a host of services that would emanate from that. For example, because one imagines that the sizes of plots of land would not be as ridiculously large as they are at this point in time, because as well, where these are spoils of conquest, and as a result, we have in South Africa this peculiar situation where the land sizes are so huge, which means that you might have a multiplicity of producers, albeit working plots that are sustainable for economic purposes, not only for themselves as families, but also for the greater national good in terms of food security. Now there'll be a demand, for instance, for things like transport, maintenance of machinery, sales of machinery, production of inputs such as fertilizer, you name it, and so on and so forth. So there are knock-on effects that would follow. But I do take the point, and I thought I did mention that all the other dimensions of the land question are also important. For instance, the housing question. And here, when we get to a point, as I've been proposing, where we have a holistic approach and perspective on the land question, we can bring all these strands together. And there we can see how they relate to one another and how they contribute towards ensuring prosperity for the citizens of the country by and large. So my use of agriculture was really purely for illustrative purposes. For illustrative. And the document that you referred to when you introduced me does touch on some of those points and how they interrelate. But I just felt I need to sort of focus more specifically on the agricultural side.
No, that's and indeed,
yes. And then your second book, sorry, I'm thinking about the book now because I wanted to refer to what the book says. But your second point about the emphasis that I'm placing on agency. And you're wondering whether and to what extent it is possible to have a patriotic parliament consisting of people who would be able to enact laws that can address the land question. Indeed, yeah. I agree with you entirely. That is possible. But that again depends on the political constitutional context that you have in place. In South Africa, the political constitutional context that we have is the product of a negotiated settlement.
Yeah.
And as the years are rolling by, we're beginning increasingly to realize how lopsided this settlement has been and how skewed it has been in favor of the previous status quo. So much as I want to believe that many of the men and women who are in parliament today do their level best to do a good job, but I'm also consciously aware of the fact that they are constrained by what I refer to as the political constitutional context. Now, what would unravel that political constitutional context, in my view, is precisely that which would be driven by the agency, by the exercise of the agency of the people, where the people from the bottom up would then position themselves to put pressure to bear, to rethink and recalibrate the whole edifice that we now have, which is encapsulated in our constitution and the laws that we have, because these are having the effect of hamstringing even the best amongst us in terms of our efforts to bring about genuine transformation, and not least, and certainly so, to bring about the genuine resolution of the land question.
Look, I understand that the dynamic will be very different once land is obtained through the agency of the people, more especially through that what you refer to as the bottom-up approach, because what would then arise would be something totally different to what is on the table and what is being discussed right now. I just wanted to touch on something. I'm realizing that we have run out of our time, but I do want you to comment on what I see as possibly a contradiction to your earlier point that you made about what we do in addressing, the land problem in the country. One of the things that you mentioned is that we have to expropriate the land without compensation. And then immediately thereafter, you then present a possibility that we could consider compensation on moral grounds limited to the developments on the land. And I'm asking myself a question: how different is that to what the present government is proposing and has been proposing? Because if you then say to me that we fight as African people who have been dispossessed of the land for centuries and gain this land, and then we want to compensate those who have dispossessed us of the land, because we are moral people, we want to compensate them for the developments that they have made on this land. Imagine the developments that have been seen in the mining sector, the developments that you see in the cities. There are areas, for instance, in the piece of land, for instance, in the Midrand area in Johannesburg, where there is the Mall of Africa and all of those places, and that land is owned by a family. And which is why people who buy properties in those spaces of land, more especially in that area, cannot said to be, taking full ownership of that land because it doesn't belong to them, unless that family, signs that they agree to release that land. And are we saying, therefore, that we shall compensate all of these people who have dispossessed us of the land? And largely, that is what the white people have been fighting for, that they be compensated for all of the developments that they did. And if you look at, what these white people have done, they would basically take this land back, largely, on the basis of the compensation that we would give to them, limited to what you call the developments on the land. Is that not a contradiction?
No, not at all. not the way I see it. Look, I've been saying that there should be no compensation for the land. Nobody came from anywhere carrying land when they came to Africa. And we know for a fact that the land, which has subsequently devolved to families such as the one that you are referring to, came or was initially acquired as spoils of conquest. So there's no question about compensation for land. That one is clear. But when it comes to improvements, yes, I take your point about the cost of some of the improvements. And this is where, as I was calling later on for a multidisciplinary approach, we need to apply our minds further on how best to approach such questions. But in the agricultural sector, to my mind, this is fairly straightforward because you know that by and large, the farmers, most of them, put up those improvements utilizing state funding. Hence, I was saying that investment by the state has to be discounted. Even the current constitution, as it is written at the moment in section 25, does refer to taking into account investments on the land. So in the agricultural part of the equation, I want to believe that it would not be as complex or as difficult as you are highlighting with regard to urban aspects of dealing with the compensation issue. But again, you see, the point I'm making about doing this on moral grounds, perhaps one should have put a rider to that, to say, but to what, how far do you go in exercising your morality and magnanimity when you address or when you tackle this issue? And indeed, it may well be that if it's prohibitively expensive to the extent of being unaffordable, then what is the point?
Exactly.
Of even considering compensation under those circumstances. And again, let's remember, much as the holders of the land would make us believe that they are innocent in the sense that they just went to the market, found that this property, there's a property that's available, and they innocently entered into a transaction to obtain the property. That is actually not true. They know there is not a single person in that position who can say that they do not know the history of this country, which has at its very foundation, at its very core, the history of land in this country, the brutal dispossession of the indigenous people of their land. But they believe, of course, that they can continue as business as usual. And as you are aware in the negotiations, these were some of the issues that they fought tenaciously because they did not want anything that would even come anywhere close to suggesting that at some point in time, they may have to relinquish their land. Hence, they fought tooth and nail to ensure that there were all these built-in caveats and conditionalities and so on and so forth. So they know. And if indeed it becomes, as we are indicating, and in fact you are correct, let me agree, that it is unaffordable, then the government will have to decide how it approaches that issue. In other words, how far does or should magnanimity or morality, or whatever you want to call it, go? Because the land, the value of the land may be minuscule compared to the value of the improvements. And this is something which those of our colleagues who work in those areas in terms of conducting their research and analysis should assist in finding answers to.
No, thanks, Professor Mayende. I just want to end off with maybe two issues. One is your point around the nationalization versus socialization, and you are saying, you are inadvertently opposed to the nationalization of land. And in the same vein, you seem to be supporting the nationalization of land, because how do you then socialize the land without nationalizing it? I think the first premise would be to nationalize the land and then socialize it afterwards. It would be virtually impossible for you to socialize or engage in a program of socialization without engaging in a program of nationalization. So I think that, we need to agree that it would be virtually impossible for you to engage in a program of socialization without having had a program of nationalization of that land. Okay, so that is just by way of my past.
No, perhaps if you can allow me to just put a finger on this one and say I agree with you.
Okay, cool.
You see, what prompted this formulation? Is that there are those amongst us who see nationalization as an end in itself.
No, it isn't.
That is the problem. You see, hence, the way we should look at it is that the mode of acquisition, the methodology of acquisition must be informed by the quest to socialize the land, as opposed to simply bringing it under the ambit of state ownership, because that is what simple nationalization entails. So.
Yeah. No. What I'm saying is that there would have to be an intervention by the state in the solution of the land. So I understand you and Professor Kontra are saying it's a bit of a myth, this thing of state land. I don't necessarily think so, and because for you to be able to address, I'm just emphasizing the point that for you to be able to address, the land question, there would have to be an intervention by the state, and the state would have to take ownership of some of the pieces of land. And before we decide how then we address, the question, because for you to be able to address the question, you need to solve the problem, and solving the problem would involve the intervention by the state. And in that process, the state would then take ownership of the land and then engage in the program of redistribution. And that program of redistribution would then entail issues of socialization and other aspects that you spoke to. So the other point that I wanted to hear you comment on, largely because of the extent of your research on the agrarian question, in terms of issues of food production. I just want to hear you commenting on whether food sovereignty should not be a program that is supported by people engaged in the land struggle, as opposed to what you were talking about with regards to food security and production. Because, where I come from, it is that food sovereignty is about putting the people who are engaged in the food production value chain at the center of policy formulation and at the center of the thinking around the production and the distribution of food in any country. So what is your take on this issue of food sovereignty as opposed to, the market-dominated food security program?
Okay, thank you. Let me start with your second point. I agree. Okay. I agree with you entirely. Let me say I agree with you entirely on that one.
Thank you.
That those engaged in the actual production, and we're looking now. This is what we're envisaging for the future. let us rather say those who will be or would be engaged in food production are the ones who should make those determinations that you're pointing out. So in other words, yes, I agree with you entirely on that one.
Okay, cool.
But on the one about land, state land being a myth, again, you see, we need to be very careful what we're talking about here when we say.
Not the present state land, Professor Mayende, not the present state land. I'm talking about state intervention in the land solution. And what I'm talking about is the state intervening by way of expropriating, because when you expropriate, you can't expropriate that land as an individual, as Professor Mayende. The state will have to expropriate. When we speak of land possession, we are talking about the state repossessing the land. We are not talking about, the less than 14% of the land that is presently under the custody of the state. We are talking about the whole country being repossessed. And then once repossessed, then what do you do with the land that is at your disposal? And that is when you intervene as the state and begin programs of socialization, begin programs of redistribution that we were talking about. That is where I was coming from with my comment.
Yes, precisely. From a strictly legal point of view, obviously, the process of expropriation goes in accordance with what we are saying, where the state obtains the land and becomes the de facto
custodian.
Yes, and then embarks on all those processes. But why I'm saying we have to be careful is that we must be clear as to what the main motive force is in this process. Is it the state or is it the people?
It is the people, we agreed.
Yes, we agree that it is the people. So the state becomes a conduit through which that which is desired by the people gets transmitted and gets addressed and dealt with. If we are agreeing in that context, then it's fine. I also agree with you on that one. But what is very important in all of this is not to exclude the people, because once you exclude the people, then you end up with a top-down approach where a particular political party may come into power, and then if it has whatever majority in parliament, change the constitution, whatever, and then embark on wholesale nationalization and then make determinations on what is to be done with the land. I'm saying that what you actually need is that process of change towards a genuine process of addressing the land question must involve two critical players, which on the one hand are the people using their agency, and then a progressive state working in tandem with the people.
No. Thank you, Professor Mayende. We have run out of our time. We can't have enough time for this kind of discussion, and I'm sure you would agree with me that we would need a bit more time to engage further on this subject. This is not done by any stroke of imagination. And I'm presuming that there are a couple of people who are requesting that you share your notes with us and with them. I'm not sure whether you'll make your notes available so that I can extend them to the people who are requesting your paper, and I presume that will happen. So there are people who do want to, interface with your input there. So let's oblige them. Yeah. Any?
Yes, but I hope, and I'm sure they will. Those who are saying that would appreciate the fact that, obviously, after doing the presentation, you have to go back and write it in a much more readable.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
And even perhaps even consider the possibility of getting it published. So I don't know.
So we'll look into that.
I might wish to say something here.
I don't know if he wants to comment. Comrade Kondlo, you want to say something? Let me just.
Is Professor Gordon?
Yeah, he's here. Hey.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all I can say is that I think this was a beautiful presentation. And of course, to write it down as a paper will probably take a bit of time. And I'm not sure whether we want the paper or we want to wait for an oncoming publication by Professor Mayen on the land question in South Africa. So we need to choose whether wait until the book is out or get a paper in the meantime. But I think it would be a beautiful piece of work to read, definitely.
I think we want both, Comrade Kondlo. We want the paper.
We can finesse those issues
later on. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Any last comments from your side before I close off?
No, mine is really just to once again thank Azapo for the opportunity. And I must say the way you framed the question, I mean, the topic got me thinking very deeply, and I had to work flat out for quite some time and look at some of the concepts again and again, but also some of the questions that have been raised are also eye-opening in various ways. But I think overall, what has transpired today really emphasizes, yes, the need for collaborative work to take place in dealing with this topic across disciplines, even across political perspectives, because it is not a simple and straightforward phenomenon.
Certainly.
Yeah, and with those words, I really must say I also enjoyed the opportunity. Thank you.
No, thank you, Professor Mayende. I really enjoyed the interaction with you, and I'm looking through the commentary that is coming on Facebook and here, and I can see that people really enjoyed your presentation, and we look forward to your book towards the end of the year, and hopefully we look forward to having you back here, to engage further on this very important question. And thank you for spending the 2 hours with us. It was really appreciated. That's where we end it for today, people. And let's look forward to next Sunday, same time, 1 o'clock, where we would be hosting Professor Bani Pityana. We will be looking at the quest for true humanity. Thank you, and goodbye for today.
Struggle was not red. I experienced it, being deprived, being oppressed, even confused. It's enough now, we're taking the power back. We're stronger than before, we're proud to